O 5 para o inglês?
Marcelo.
O 5 para o inglês?
Não. 2 português.
3 em inglês. Vai sentar agora. Não vou estar aí.
Eu chamo. Bom dia, senhoras e senhores. Temos a grande honra de dar continuidade ao nosso colóquio acadêmico. Apenas uma informação: haverá tradução simultânea. Canal 2 para o português e canal 3 sociais, professor doutor Carlos Blanco de Moraes. Tenho a honra de convidar Luiz.
Ficarem as pessoas aqui, verem o vídeo e depois compomos a mesa.
Então, mas eu chamo...
Não, para já não, mais tarde.
Ah, tá. Então, com a palavra, o professor Blanco para a condução dos trabalhos.
Ora, bom dia a todos. Portanto, terminámos ontem o nosso seminário e hoje vamos iniciar um workshop sobre um tema da maior atualidade que, enfim, que se designa por democracia, imprensa profissional e redes sociais. O orador principal da primeira parte da sessão da manhã, que, portanto, é um pesquisador da Universidade de Stanford, muito conhecido, que é Evgeny Morozov, não pôde vir porque a mãe sofreu um acidente e ele teve que viajar para a Bielorrússia e hoje, precisamente neste momento de manhã, enfim, esse familiar está a ser operado. Ele, contudo, mandou-nos um vídeo, que nós vamos, ainda é um vídeo de 40 minutos, em inglês, que vamos exibir. E então, só depois da exibição do vídeo, nós formaremos um painel de apreciação e discussão. E, portanto, talvez para não demorar mais a sessão, eu pediria para que o vídeo fosse exibido e só depois faremos a constituição da mesa. For our foreign guests, welcome to Lisbon. We will begin to show the video of Evgeny Morozov about social networks, democracy, and the press, and the professional press. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm first of all very sorry that I could not be with you in person in Lisbon. Unfortunately, because of some personal circumstances, I had to stay with my family actually in Belarus this week. So again, my apologies for not making it in person, but I hope that this video would at least provide some food for thought and discussion at the event. I don't know yet if I'll be able to join the discussion after the video, but if I can, then maybe I can answer also some of the questions that this video would trigger. Good. So I suppose the theme for discussion this week and today is the impact of digital media and platforms and social networks and what is increasingly called the big tech on media, on journalism, on various information and communication functions of democratic societies. And I would argue, of course, that such a discussion about the impact of big tech and the structural effects and influence of firms like Google and Amazon and Facebook, but also their Chinese counterparts on other domains of society is happening pretty much across the board, right? So it's not just journalism and it's not just media that are in some way are struggling with figuring out what the right relationship should be. So what I would like to do today is to maybe give a very broad overview at the beginning of how I see this structural change happening in society. Because I would argue that Google and Facebook and Amazon and all these firms, they're not just a one-off blip which will be tamed industry by industry and somehow we will settle on a new equilibrium of power. I don't think that that's going to happen, and that they represent a much bigger challenge to how not just various industries but also various parts of society need to, well, have organized themselves and need to reorganize themselves in the future. And it's only by approaching this issue holistically, by understanding this structural change that they trigger, that we would be able to arrive at effective solutions in dealing with them. And I think this aspect, I will try to make it clear as I move through my talk, but I think it's very important to understand that without having this more holistic structural aspect, the temptation is to go for relatively narrow piecemeal solutions industry by industry. So in media, we will do this, we will give greater responsibility to the firms, we will go for some kind of greater intermediary liability solutions. In cybersecurity, we will go for a similar solution. In transportation, where Uber is very actively disrupting the existing public transportation system, we'll go for yet another solution. And I think that it might make sense when you look at this set of issues from a narrow perspective to think that way, but I think that ultimately the power and the resources and the revolutionary nature of these firms and their business models is such that it will be very hard for the rest of society to win through such a piecemeal logic. So let me, as I promised, let me maybe give some perspective on how I see the structural change happening. And we will then slowly move back to the sphere of media and journalism, but I think it's very important to understand, as I've said, that the problems that affect media and journalism are not unique to this sector, even though it might seem that way. And one last word of disclosure is that I'm not by any means an insider in the media sphere, other than having a column in a couple of newspapers and regularly dealing with media as a journalist. So I do not pretend to have some inside knowledge about how the media industry works and what drives it. I've observed it for a while, and I think that its problems are common to problems of other sectors that are currently being reshaped by digital technology. So having said all of that, let me move into the specifics. So I would argue that there are three big factors, three big developments, so to say, three big, you can argue, activities that these big tech firms have been pursuing over the last 10-15 years. And it's those three activities which have, in one way or another, created the mass that we would now call fake news, or we would call them, precarious labor conditions of Uber drivers, or we would call them, as I have called them in my book, solutionism. So let me walk you through those three trends. So trend number one, or if you want to put it that way, strategy number one of the big tech industry is what I would call data extractivism. And it's very important to understand that ultimately much of what Facebook and Google and Amazon have been doing in the last 10 to 15 years has been trying to find a way to extract as much data from the users as possible, and then to find ways to monetize that data better. So in some sense, they were almost like a throwback to some kind of merchant capitalism, where, you know, before the industrialization, merchants were traveling the world and getting things cheap and selling them dear. You know, so in this case, data to some extent became one such commodity where technology firms that were better positioned to exploit it found a way to monetize it better than other companies or other users, right? And of course, the conventional, traditional story that we have heard in that respect was about advertising, right? It traditionally insisted that the technology firms essentially extract data because it allows them to sell cheaper or more efficient, more effective personalized advertising. So the models of Google and Facebook are all based on that principle, right? That you can offer services to users who are mostly consumers and not firms and not necessarily governments. And those users would be using your search engine or your email or your social network, generate some data, and then that data will be monetized by packaging it in advertising products that will then be resold to the actual clients of these firms, which would be companies, governments, small businesses, and so forth. As you can clearly see, there are several problematic areas related to this dynamic of data extractivism. Problem number one is that essentially it creates rather perverse incentives for the tech companies to go on extracting the data. So the tech companies essentially, since they know that we, the users, have the data that they need, they deploy all sorts of tricks at the level of design of their platforms and the features, and all sorts of psychological tricks by hiring anthropologists and psychologists and designers to basically make sure that we surrender as much data as possible to them, right? And then it creates all of problems. Some new interaction has happened on the platform, somebody has liked our post, and so forth, right? So a lot of it is driven by a very banal rationale, which is to extract the data. And this once merged, was inserted into other dynamics related to the circulation of content, creates once again rather perverse dynamics. So, you know, much in this problem that we have misdiagnosed, in my opinion, as fake news, has to do with the fact that, you know, the firms that operate the services essentially gain extra revenue and gain extra data the more their users engage with content, right? And so they have absolutely no incentives, and rather they have actually perverse counter incentives to make sure that the information that's being exchanged domains and industries which they improve with it is, of course, artificial intelligence, which is not at all a problem per se, but it just shows us how the early mover advantage in this relatively trivial advertising business, which nobody would ever consider important, has created dynamics such that essentially now these firms are emerging as key leaders in many other areas which we would consider much more strategic, simply because they got the data which allowed them to develop artificial intelligence. So all of a sudden, Google and Amazon and Microsoft are emerging as champions of more efficient healthcare solutions, education solutions, public transportation solutions, and so forth. All of that solely because they have the right data and they have the right artificial intelligence to pull it off, right? And then, of course, there are many concerns and worries about the political economy let's put it that way, of leaving so much data and so much AI in the hands of just a couple of firms. And then there are, of course, a geopolitical level related to the fact that it's a competition between American and Chinese players, by and large. But one aspect that I think is of interest to us here in the context of information and journalism and media and fake news is that increasingly these very tools of artificial intelligence are being packaged as fact-checking and as some kind of online automated verification as a service mechanism, which other newspapers and journalists and media organizations can essentially purchase from Google and Amazon and perhaps Facebook at some future point at a price. So essentially, truth becomes codified in data sets of some kind, and then since those companies are the ones who have those data sets, they're the ones who are then also offering us at a fee to see whether some piece of content matches the truth or not. And increasingly, I mean, that's the leads us to the second problem, or the second dynamic rather than the problem that I wanted to talk about of the three. So the first one was data extractivism. The second one is this increased commodification of solutions to social problems, which are increasingly to be sought and to be found in the offerings of the big tech industry. So, if you think about how it is that we will be tackling problems like the energy crisis, how we'll be tackling problems like cybersecurity, how we'll be tackling problems related to fake news. I mean, the solution is one. You turn to Google or Facebook or Amazon or Alibaba or Baidu, and these firms will offer you a very nice and clean technological solution of some kind, and they will offer it to you at a small fee of some kind as well. Which, in the context of cybersecurity, means that basically, you will pay a fee a month or a year in order for these firms to tap into the artificial intelligence to protect you. In the case of journalism, you'll pay them a fee of some kind in order for them to tap into artificial intelligence and use their databases of truth to essentially verify whether a piece of data is correct or not. In the case of energy, it will be the same. So Google, a couple of years ago, published a report that they've managed to cut energy-related costs in their server farms by 40% by tapping into artificial intelligence, and now they're offering it as a service to others. Right? So this, what I used to call solutionism in my previous book, I think has also a very bizarre political economy, which has very unpredictable and very often unpleasant political effects, because it shrinks the political space to this very banal choice. And that choice is actually just between whether you're going to delegate your problem solving at the kind of political and social level to big tech firms that will deploy AI to do it. And I think if that's what we have left on our plate when it comes to political life, it's a pretty sad state of affairs, which will probably generate some disenchantment among citizens. This does not necessarily have anything to do with fake news or journalism or media as such. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that this way of solving our problems very often deflects attention from the actual contribution of this very industry to the problems that we are trying to solve. So, in the case of cloud computing and AI, they emit a huge amount of energy, which contributes actually quite a lot to the ongoing climate crisis. In the case of fake news, it's good that they have these AI solutions, but to some extent you can argue that the problem exists because their very advertising-based business models are just highly attractive and highly stimulating to the generation of fake news. And it's the same with cybersecurity. I mean, it's all well and good for Microsoft to be offering some kind of cybersecurity solutions, which you can buy from them at a fee. But the reason why our computers are so vulnerable also partly has to do with the fact that Microsoft software is not always up to date, and Microsoft's motivation is not often aligned with the interests of security professionals who actually prefer to work with code that they can examine and verify, and that's why they go often for free software solutions. So this is just to highlight this disjuncture between more ambitious ways of tackling this information crisis facing democracy on the one hand, and what these companies present to us as the right solution, the cleanest and the most efficient one. And very often it's not the case at all. And the third dynamic, in addition to this kind of rise of data extractivism and rise of solutionism, I would argue is the way in which these firms increasingly seek and achieve profitability by externalizing the cost of their operation on society. So essentially what you get is a very predictable situation, which you all know from just reading the news, right? So in many parts of this industry, this is a much easier problem to spot. So in the case of Uber, we all know that Uber owns no cars, it does not technically employ any drivers, so all those costs are offloaded on somebody else. Very often they are offloaded on drivers who perform a service of some kind to Uber, even though Uber claims to be just a platform, and often it's offloaded on not so much on consumers yet, because in the case of Uber it's offloaded on its funders, venture capital funds and sovereign wealth funds, who are essentially subsidizing the rights of many of us. So we do not really understand the true costs of its operations. But Uber, I think, is kind of one of the easiest examples. It's much harder to understand what those hidden and externalized costs are when it comes to Facebook, when it comes to Google, when it comes to Twitter, when it comes to firms that have a much more convoluted and opaque business model. And you do not, because most users who go to Twitter and who go to Google, if you go to Google, you probably don't know how Google's desire to ensure that you're not a robot, and so that they would ask you to check some photos of a street with green lights and not with bicycles. We've all done those anti-spam picture selection exercises, but you wouldn't know how that activity in itself relates to the fact that Google might be selling or considered selling software based on automated object recognition to military, right? Meaning that your training of Google systems to recognize objects, which is what you do when you fill in the anti-spam exercise, contributes to the development of a platform which is then being sold and monetized by striking contracts with Pentagon and so forth, right? So most people have zero understanding of how those business models work, because Google does its best to essentially hide them, right? So there are a few questions asked about them. So in the case of media and journalism and fake news, I think here we have a couple of important aspects related to this hidden externalization of costs. First of all, it's that the costs of falsehood and the costs of false information, Google and Facebook and Twitter, they don't really much care what those costs are, right? And there is nothing in their model that would automatically force them to eliminate false information as long as false information is profitable, right? So basically, up until society started paying more attention to their business models in the wake of the election of Donald Trump, the standard response of these firms was, we are going to essentially let everybody publish whatever they want. We are not going to take down information that's false unless something really bad happens and you inform us, so we do not take any proactive responsibility towards cleaning up our own platforms. Right, so essentially there it was quite obvious that the model was, well, you publish something and then society suffers the costs of that falsehood, and if society then mobilizes enough resources and pushes the company to remove that content, that will be done. But if there is not enough of an active effort to push this company, Facebook or Google or Twitter, to remove something, the information will stay there forever. So essentially here you can see how the costs of falsehood were in fact offloaded to society, and it's out of such costs that some of these populist movements have emerged, right? So ultimately, if you create a new generation of firms which have become some of the most dominant firms of the society and of the economy as a whole, and if you then essentially tell those firms to self-regulate, but those firms also do their best to monetize falsehoods, then you do end up in a society where people who make all sorts of untrue demagogic claims end up abusing or profiting from that system. I wouldn't even call it abuse, because technically these populist movements have been using this system exactly how it is meant to be used. They've been aiming to generate traffic, and how do you generate traffic? You do it by saying things that are outrageous, that are wrong, that are basically inaccurate, but that drive engagement, right? And this engagement part, it's very important to understand that it's been at the heart of business models of these companies. So what do they want to do? They want engagement. So if you look at why something like Cambridge Analytica happened, it happened for a very simple reason. Facebook needed to grow really fast, right? So I told you that what drives these firms was data extractivism, right? But of course, data extractivism is just a natural consequence of capitalist competition, and capitalist competition requires firms to either grow or die, right? So you either grow and expand and become big, or you get eaten by others who do all of that but faster than you. So in the case of technology companies, their social networks, here I'm talking about actual social networks within me and my friends rather than digital ones, to open up all those social graphs and data associated with them to third-party developers. Because at some point in 2012, 2014, 2015, roughly in that period, Facebook thought it was a good idea to grow by sharing our data, using it strategically, inviting other developers to build applications on top of that data, so that we would not need to develop any of new features in-house and spend tons of money on it. So for Facebook, it was a very good deal. You invite somebody like Cambridge Analytica, they build these ridiculous psychometric tests, which users can fill in. It drives engagement on Facebook, so it was kind of a win-win. The people behind Cambridge Analytica got the data that they needed. Facebook got some more engagement from this ability and this option, if you will, to have their mind and to have their political ideological beliefs to be manipulated by an entity like Cambridge Analytica. I mean, that story is too complex to give you the entire background, but I think I've said enough for you to grasp that ultimately Facebook's users found themselves to be prisoners or hostages in this immense growth at all costs operation. And it's by far not the only company that dabbled in such dark magic, if you want to call it that way. So they really, it's a classical business school kind of expansion strategy. You want to grow, and you want to grow as cheap as possible and as fast as possible. And if you have something that would help to offload those costs on others, in this case on third-party developers, you do that. Now, so with these three kind of dynamics, data extractivism, solutionism, and this externalization of costs, I think we can kind of grasp how industry by industry, this new set of players have managed to essentially redefine the terms of engagement between themselves and other players. So it would be between them and media in the case of journalism, but also between them and democratic institutions. And of course, After the battlefield and the landscape has been redefined, and has been redefined quite dramatically, so that it became possible to insert falsehoods and have those falsehoods circulate in a way that would be profitable to the business models of these firms. There have been all sorts of external actors, from publicity agencies, PR firms, lobbyists, foreign governments, hostile governments, I don't know, ISIS, I mean, you name it. Virtually anybody with any agenda has realized that this space is there for the grabbing, and you can essentially manipulate it and twist it very well at a very small budget. But again, that was not some kind of deviation from the model. This is how this advertising-driven digital economy is supposed to work, right? So since I don't have that much time, let me quickly talk about the solutions. So, one solution, as I said, will be to go industry by industry and assume that the dynamics and the problems faced by transportation industry are different from the media industry, and media industry is different from energy industry, and energy industry is different from, I don't know, music industry, that, Silicon Valley disrupts, or digital capitalism, if you will, disrupts every industry differently. So we then go, and I'm not a lawyer, so I have no stake, in this fight, but I can imagine that there will be quite a few specialized legal professionals who would say, fine, in this industry we do this, in that industry we do that, and here we do this. I just think that this targeted approach, it's not going to be very efficient without a more structural, more holistic intervention into the digital economy. So, I don't really have time to go into the shortcomings of current European approaches with regards to antitrust and with regards to GDPR, but those are kind of the two solutions that come closest to some kind of structural intervention that I'm looking for, but they don't go far enough, and I just don't have time to delve into my critique of them. I've written extensively about it in my columns. Let me just say what kind of solution I have in mind. So my solution to the problem of the circulation of erroneous information online and to the dissemination of fake news would not be to deputize these firms to deploy even more artificial intelligence to identify suspicious people and to remove them. Right, because Facebook already is experimenting with some kind of a social scoring system where they would like to assign every user a score, and then based on who your friends are, you will receive some rating, and then you might as well become invisible on the site, right? If Facebook suspects that you have something dangerous to say. Again, I don't think that that's a kind of healthy level of power for these firms to have in a vibrant modern public sphere. Right? I don't think that this degree of visibility should be decided by the quality of my social circle. I mean, we're already now seeing people who start having problems just because they have friends who have dissenting or dangerous opinions. I'm not overstating it. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where, simply because you went and visited, Julian Assange at the embassy in London once, then because you wanted to express solidarity, support, or just to interview him, then your Facebook or Twitter posts would then become less visible, right? To some extent, this is, you might argue, what the Chinese are trying to say now with the social credit system. Right, to tie our real world activity to our online activity so that you will be rewarded or punished in both worlds depending on your behavior. And to some extent we have something similar now emerging in the West, but with private companies like Facebook and Uber deciding upon how much visibility and how much rights and privileges to give us, which has prompted some people to start talking about the return to techno-feudalism, because ultimately so much power and private power completely outside of the jurisdiction of the state is concentrated in the hands of these firms. Leaving that broader discussion aside, what I wanted to say is as follows. For me, it's obvious that the best solution to fight the circulation of false information and fake news online is by reducing the speed and the velocity and the kind of force that such false, erroneous, demagogic information has. and you can only do it by decoupling that speed and that velocity and that intensity from the logic of advertising and from the business models based on advertising. So you basically need to make sure that the platforms which publish this information have no incentive whatsoever in and have no interest in whatsoever in boosting up the numbers of how many times a given post has been shared. So you don't want to be in a situation where we are right now, where Facebook and Twitter directly benefit from the fact that certain posts, however erroneous they are, get shared 1,000,000 times, and certain posts that are correct get shared just twice. Right? That, to me, is not a healthy situation. What I would like to have is a platform that, if not focused on quality, you know, it's a kind of a problematic thing to define what qualifies as quality, and we all know that, but at least that are neutral, that, you know, that have no kind of inherent built-in business interest in order to make stuff that is hot, that is trending, to become even hotter and more trending. And to me, it seems that's the only way to do that is to essentially start thinking about an alternative infrastructure which will do for digital media what public media has done for the normal media sphere. Meaning that, you know, at some point, as we were building the welfare state, we understood that it's very important to have public media that is not driven by advertising, that is not responsible to the interest of its donors and its owners, but that is responsible to the state and that is responsible to the interest of the public. Right? And I find a lot of discussions that are now beginning to occur in Germany and in France about building a public service or public sector alternative to YouTube and similar platforms. I find it to be robust and I find it to be quite healthy. We are probably 15 years late. Again, whoever is going to build it will need to pursue a very different strategy from the one pursued when BBC was set up, for example, or whatever its local alternative might be in Portugal or elsewhere, where, of course, from the very beginning there was a fair degree of centralization and elitism, and clearly it will be very hard to expect that the public sector right now, as shrunk and as affected by, in 2018, these four firms, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and Google, have had $75 billion in capital investment, right? That year, it's $4 billion more than four largest oil companies. So clearly, the amount of money that flows into the development of data centers, AI, infrastructures, and so forth is immense. So you cannot expect the public sector to match it at that level. But I think we can do still something, especially if you manage to create a level playing field for individual entrepreneurs, startups, NGOs, and others to be able to, so that they can plug into this process of innovation. So, we need a new kind of public media which would respect the ability of the public to contribute and would not just prophesize to the public from the pulpit as BBC used to do, right? So we need a robust, democratic, decentralized, algorithmic digital media of some kind, which would involve the public, including local small startups, and not just Uber, Google, and these firms that have billions at their disposal, into the innovation process. And I think that the precondition for that happening, and this is where we come back to the kind of broader structural transformative agenda I have tried to put on the table, is that you can only do that if the public sector itself first manages to reconquer the most important parts of digital infrastructure. And that, at this time, would be things like data and artificial intelligence. And again, how exactly it will be done, and how to square it with GDPR. I mean, those are fantastic, immense, giant questions, which you can organize, dozens of legal forums on, and still probably not arrive at a solution. But I think this vision is very important to have in mind, because you can actually have some of that infrastructure under some kind of formal public control. So you would be able to decide who has access to it. Meaning that you can say, if you are a local Portuguese startup and you would like to build an app that will recommend me clips based on clips I have watched in the past, which is what YouTube does, you can say that our local small startups can do that first before Google and Facebook and Uber and their funders like SoftBank come in and essentially swallow everything, right? Because what we want to do is also to have a robust civil society and kind of SME entrepreneur kind of activity, and not just a couple of American and Chinese firms dominating and swallowing the entire digital economy, right? So in order to do that, you need to have a robust set of mechanisms to basically say, fine, if you're Google and Facebook and if you want to do that, you have to pay a little bit more than if you are a local startup that would like to do it and we'll give you a subsidy. Of course, that will go against virtually possibly every single trade rule that we have been celebrating for the last 25, 30, if not more years. And I understand the immense, bold nature of this agenda. And clearly, if you were to solve just the narrow problem of fake news and circulation of fake information, this is overkill, right? You don't really need to go all the way there in order to solve that problem. But this is why, from the very beginning, I tried to convince you that the problem is much broader in scope, and that unless we define the problem by looking at all the other industries and all the other domains where similar problems pop up, we'll end up with relatively tame and narrow solutions, out of which these firms would be able to buy their way out. I mean, you have to understand, these are probably one of the most profitable firms in history. They can afford to lose $1 million, $1 billion, 10 billion. It's a piece of cake for them, right? So, and again, I don't think I've called for anything overly radical in terms of breaking them up or nationalizing them. I didn't say anything of the kind, even though these ideas are floating in discussions about antitrust, for example, in the United States even. What I have proposed only was to think strategically for a structural transformative solution at the infrastructure level, like data and AI, and then to go for interventions that will not go for, that will not just try to somehow mitigate the effects of their business activity. So, you allow them to go even deeper into the advertising business models, and then you put some AI to catch the bad apples. No, that's not what I want. What I would like to do is to basically find a way how we can uncouple a lot of the activities we currently have in the digital economy from the logic of advertising. Not because I hate advertising, but because I think in this particular context, and the level of granular access to our households, families, cars, cities, personalities, wallets, and so forth, these companies have an enormous power to shape our behavior to serve their own business interests. And it's not healthy in a democracy, and we don't have the mechanisms to resolve it. So I've been speaking for 40 minutes. I think here we'll wrap up. I'm already probably 5-10 minutes overdue. I hope you'll have a productive discussion. I hope I have stimulated it somewhat. Again, I'm neither a journalist nor a lawyer nor a media professional, so I hope it's somewhat relevant. If it's not, at least you could always stop the video and do something else. Okay, so thank you very much, and once again, sorry that I couldn't join you in person.
Dando sequência a esse painel, eu convido o professor Dr. Carlos Blanco de Moraes, doutor em Direito pela Universidade de Lisboa, professor catedrático da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Lisboa, para presidir esse ato. Convido a senhora Luísa Meirelles, diretora da agência Lusa, para se integrar à mesa. Convido o senhor Ricardo Costa, diretor-geral de Informação. Convido, na sequência, a senhora Sofia Ranchordas, doutora em Direito pela Universidade de Trebo e pela Universidade de Antupéia e professora da Universidade de Groningen. Convido o professor Dr. Francisco Balaguer Caleron, doutor em Direito e professor catedrático da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Granada.
Muito bem, vamos começar então o nosso painel. Enfim, eu acho que não se percebeu inteiramente tudo aquilo que disse o professor Morozov, porque, enfim, a acústica não era a melhor do lado de lá, enfim. E, de qualquer forma, vou dar início às intervenções, pedindo, em primeiro lugar, à doutora Luísa Meireles para iniciar esta discussão. Muito obrigado.
Então, bom dia a todos. Eu penso que vocês estão já familiarizados, ou talvez não sei, com as ideias de Evgeny Morozov sobre os seus, digamos, as suas ideias sobre as grandes as Big Tech, mas eu, como jornalista, gostaria de falar de outro ponto e, portanto, também, se me permitem, enfim, gostaria de falar como jornalista que sou e que fui toda a vida, apesar de ter sido advogada, não é? Sou licenciada por esta casa e fui advogada durante alguns anos. Por isso, bom dia a todos. Eu queria agradecer aos ilustres organizadores deste fórum o facto de me terem convidado e tenho sido ao longo destes últimos anos assídua espectadora das vossas sessões e até moderadora. Desta vez sou palestrante. Como diretora da informação da Lusa, da agência Lusa, que, como diz o nosso presidente, é a maior multinacional de informação em língua portuguesa, na medida em que não só cobre toda, é a única que existe em Portugal, cobre não só todo o território português, como tem uma grande divulgação e nos países de língua oficial portuguesa, nomeadamente nos africanos e em Timor. Por tudo isto, é uma honra para mim estar aqui e poder falar-vos ou dizer alguma coisa que valha a pena sobre este tema de a democracia, a imprensa profissional e as redes sociais. Todos nós sabemos o quanto é importante a estreita relação entre a democracia e a imprensa, ou a comunicação social no seu sentido mais global, os mídia, e efetivamente só uma comunicação social forte e vibrante é capaz de sustentar uma democracia sólida. Quando a capacidade de crítica, da acutilância e de vigilância dos mídias sobre os poderes públicos falham, a democracia acaba por falhar também. Esta é uma lição que nós aprendemos com a evolução da civilização e da consolidação da liberdade de expressão. As democracias precisam de intermediação entre poderes políticos, públicos e o povo e eleitores. Quem a faz são os mídia. Não tenhamos dúvidas disso. E, sob pena de cairmos no reino da demagogia e do populismo, com apelos insanos às emoções, cuja manipulação, também o sabemos, já nos levou a episódios dramáticos da história das nossas vidas coletivas. Costumamos dizer que vivemos tempos complexos. Tudo bem, pode ser, acredito que gerações sucessivas o disseram também, mas no que diz respeito aos mídia, os chamados mídias tradicionais já não têm o exclusivo da informação e a cada dia que passa a verdade é que perdem terreno face aos novos meios, onde as pessoas colhem informações e sim. Com a crise dos mídias tradicionais e o desenvolvimento das redes sociais, propiciado pelas novas tecnologias, a disseminação das chamadas notícias falsas, falseadas, as fake news, fez surgir uma nova realidade, com uma repercussão inusitada em todos os setores e áreas. As sociedades mudaram e a falência das escolas e até das famílias como mecanismos de socialização, por exemplo, também propiciaram o boom das tecnologias. Mas as fake news, ou a desinformação, como nós dizemos em bom português, não é ou não são apenas um resultado, desde que há sociedades humanas e a propaganda usada por governos e até agências de intelligence para influenciar o panorama político dentro e fora dos respectivos países são um aspecto conhecido há muito. A difusão de rumores ou de falsas informações são fenómenos ancestrais que se foram acentuando à medida que surgiram novos instrumentos, não só os mídia, mas o cinema, a rádio ou a televisão. Não precisamos de recuar muito longe para perceber que todos os poderes, e nem sempre autoritários ou ditatoriais, utilizaram e continuam a utilizar métodos de intoxicação mediática em defesa dos seus interesses. Lembremos-nos das recentes guerras do Afeganistão, mídia, para a democracia e para a cidadania em geral. São intencionalmente feitas para enganar os leitores e têm como objetivo, não tenho dúvidas, baralhar, desinformar e levar a decisões incorretas, em períodos eleitorais e não só. O facto de elas terem tornado um negócio que rende e vale milhões à medida dos servem muita influência, na medida em que os novos meios permitem atingir mais pessoas e potenciais eleitores. A sua disseminação não é, por si só, responsável pelos resultados eleitorais,